now I am very happy to introduce our keynote for today, Dr. Aly Cohen. She is presenting, helping us presenting environmental chemicals and human health, what we can do to reduce exposures. Dr. Cohen is familiar to many, probably all of you out there. She is a board-certified rheumatologist, integrative medicine, and environmental health expert who educates the public about the harmful toxins in our lives and their impact on health. She is the author of the best-selling book, Detoxify, the Everyday Toxins Harming Your Immune System and How to Defend Against Them. And she also creates environmental health curriculum for schools and physician training programs, such as the Academy of Integrative Health and Medicine. And she shares information on social media. She has a slide at the end here where you can see all that she offers at The Smart Human. Lots of educational resources, including a newsletter, a podcast. So stay tuned at the end and you'll see all that. And now I will turn the stage over. Welcome.
Thank you, Maggie, so much for having me and your whole team. You've been lovely so far to get started. I'm going to attempt, I'm not great at technology, but I'm going to share my screen and see if we can get going from the start. Let's see if this works. So everything looks like it's working, Maggie?
It does. It looks good.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, so thank you so much again for having me. And this is a very much of a general conversation, right? You can get into environmental chemicals in breast cancer, in mental health conditions. I'm now creating a talk on athletes and environmental health, actually, as my sons are both athletes. So there's lots of ways to frame this, but what I really wanted to do is share kind of an overview philosophically of how I process this very big topic, and how to navigate it, which I've discovered over, I don't know, maybe 19 years of doing this. So it's been a lot of trial and error in terms of education. So I'm going to get started. Let's see. So I want to start, and as I always seem to do in these communities, is share the driver for why I do what I do. This was my dog. He's a golden retriever. His name is Truxton. And he was my firstborn 19 years ago, actually 22 years ago. I guess my first son was 2.5, and my younger was, 6 months. And this was our starter child. And he was gorgeous and wonderful. And he developed something at 4.5 years of age while we had just moved to a central New Jersey farm. And he developed autoimmune hepatitis, which is literally, rare in dogs in general, but even so in golden retrievers, as the research shows. And what was so interesting at that time in my life is I just finished rheumatology fellowship training at Montefiore in New York City. I had just begun practicing. I had 2 kids. And I really had no idea how and where this came from for this dog. And immediately, given that he was so young, given that we, live on a farm, I really started to look, heartbroken into what he ate, what he drank, the toy he sucked on, which, was a big plastic toy, red toy, whatever, to avoid from eating siding and all the other things he was chewing. And I was really doing an environmental health evaluation, 20 some years ago, and didn't realize it because I had never known that there was any problems with anything that we have in our environment. I assumed government regulations, even with in the pet, industry, was really protecting all of us. I soon found out over the course of a couple of years trying to explore this, that environment plays a key role in our day-to-day lives. And what was so shocking, kind of like, maybe thinking that there's no Santa Claus anymore, is that in the human market, which I was learning a lot about while trying to investigate the dog and animal market, really is not protective in any way to our population in the United States for sure. And it extends around the world, but I'm going to be speaking about the US market now. And what I learned 22 years ago and began to build on that, not just from organizations like, Environmental Working Group, which was well into this work at that time, but I started looking up all the studies on BPA, which were the first endocrine disrupting chemical studies back in that time. The more I learned about drinking water, the more I learned about chemicals in food that's allowable, the more I learned about everyday preservatives and chemicals and coloring in food, in terms of flavoring, in terms of mouthfeel and crunch, in terms of our supplements that are allowed to have certain ingredients, our air quality, candles. The more I learned, the more I was more upset and more driven. Because what I was learning was that most of these chemicals, and again, 22 years ago, we now know so much more, they are not required for testing or safety or toxicity, especially among vulnerable populations like children, pregnant women, aging population, immune, immune compromised populations. They're not required for testing. Any of the ingredients that go into the products that go on our shelves. And we now have an estimated 300,000 of these chemicals in our products, in our building materials, in our furniture, in our cleaning products, in our personal care. And it was so mind-blowing because I was also discovering, especially with the work of my colleague who became my co-author for two books out of the three, was Dr. Frederick von Saal, who did all of the BPA studies at that time with his colleagues and actually got BPA out of baby bottles. He was the guy. Was that they had hormone effects. That's what he and his colleagues discovered, that at very, very low levels, these chemicals really can have hormonal effects. And that was the beginning of my journey. And so we now know that we're exposed all the time. This was part of my TED Talk where I was, learning from teenagers about their interest in this topic. And I was really looking at how many chemicals we're exposed to on a daily basis. And kind of adding that up and showing that even healthy stuff, whatever it is, we're getting, hit by all these things in terms of our choices, and not always our choices. Okay, so this became part of a bigger conversation. It's not just chemicals and untested or even remotely tested by, academic institutions, by the way, not manufacturing, that affect human health and whether we develop a diagnosis or a disease, okay? It's a combination of lots of lifetime experiences. And when we talk about the exposome, we're talking about the exposures that start in utero all the way through death, right? And it can include not just environmental chemicals, but also infections, also medications. Not saying all, obviously, medicines are bad, I use them all the time, but it's understanding that we anthropologically are getting exposed to many, many more things in modern day times than we ever saw throughout evolution, right? Um, Most of the chemicals that I'm, describing out of those 300,000, and, they have only been introduced into the human experience over the past 75 years to 100 years. I mean, that's an extraordinary, statement that we have been evolving for over 4.5 million years, and now we have all of these chemicals in the human experience for only 100. I went on to write a book after, two textbooks and what have you, that really brought in what I'm seeing in my rheumatology practice here in Princeton, which is that we are being, and it matches the epidemiology worldwide. We have an epidemic of environmentally exposure related diseases, and certainly autoimmune and immune disorders that I manage. We're talking people at younger ages getting diagnoses that we would never expect, similar to my dog Truxton, right? But also with no family history. And whether or not we develop a disease or get an illness, right, is a real balance. It's a real dance between our genetics, our environment, and our lifestyle. And it turns out that pretty much all three of those, but I'll argue for this conversation, two out of those three, lifestyle and exposures, are a modifiable risk for human health that we can actually insert ourselves into this conversation if we just know what to think about and what to do. So that was really the basis of my latest book, but it's really all the educational work I do. And by the way, I sell no products, I endorse no brands to keep this messaging really science-based and reasonable and believable, right? So our exposome is a combination of phones and radiation and stress and lifestyle and infections and drugs and diets and pollution, and it's a bunch of things. What I want people to feel empowered about is what you can intervene with to make changes for yourself and try to reduce the risks of a variety of health-related conditions. So endocrine disrupting chemicals were the beginning of this conversation of environmental health back in the day. And really, it started with this idea that even at these parts per million, parts per trillion levels, parts per billion levels of exposures, they work many of these chemicals that were identified, right? These are the researchers identifying them, that they can work below the radar of the classic dose makes the poison argument that we had from Paracelsus back in the 1500s, right? The idea that the more you're exposed to something, the more likely you're going to experience a problem from it, right? We can think of alcohol in college and drinking in 21. And, the more you drink, the more you're going to see problems, right? Or have more fun, depending on how you perceive that. Um, but needless to say, the argument still was very strong and still very is in certain components of manufacturing, right? But we were, what was discovered, not me, but the researchers discovered that even below what you would consider any kind of a toxic exposure, there was hormonal ability and capabilities of many of these chemicals. And BPA was one of the starter, one of the first that was ever discovered to do this. And because the human hormone system is so delicate, it's been preserved over millions of years for little bits of hormones, whether it's insulin or fertility hormones or growth and development, bone related hormones that allow for bone growth and development, brain related hormones. They are incredibly vulnerable, and there's only a little bit needed to do a lot of big things. Well, it turns out some of these chemicals were being discovered to do some of the same kind of hormonal effects. Okay. And this Time magazine, this was in 2010, was one of the first things that I saw that showed that, these vulnerable populations of human beings, certainly in utero, and I would never blame women, and I would never in a million years, you kind of look at that population as should know better, do better, because God knows I was that pregnant woman back in those days, right? But the idea is that when we see different age groups, we know that there's vulnerabilities that are specific to those age groups. And certainly in utero, when we know that chemicals can cross the placenta, this is a fact. We now know microplastics can actually affect the placenta as well. So we want to be thinking about what can we do individually instead of waiting always for regulation to change at a snail's pace to protect us, what we can do proactively. So children, again, in utero exposure is one vulnerable population. We know that children are not developing as quickly as adults in terms of their protective mechanisms. We know that they're exposed to a variety of chemicals that are at their level on the floor, hand-mouth behavior, through dust exposure, from things we bring into our homes, cleaning products, and a variety of plastics, and of course, personal care products that are not vetted. We now have the ability to figure that out. We know that we can, really bring in things into our home if we choose to that are a lot less loaded with chemicals that have been identified as problematic. Their variety in their diet is a problem because, hey, they want baby food and they're picky, but it turns out food is protective in many ways, and we'll get to those slides. So for a variety of reasons, their lifetime exposure, we know that children are uniquely vulnerable when it comes to exposures to untested, unregulated, chemicals in our everyday lives. Other areas that are considered vulnerable include puberty. This was an area where my babysitter asked me, could I die of, my shampoo? And I was like, what? And then I thought, my gosh, maybe this is a real area to dive into because these young people are most, insecure and sort of vulnerable about their body image. They're using the most products per 24 hours of any demographic. My kids were starting to become teenagers and asking for cologne and all that. So that's where the TED Talk data and pilot projects came from. But teenagers are remarkable in what they're able to do for themselves. And they're the perfect age for that. And I had just gone through 23, 25 grand rounds with physicians prior to getting into teens, and there wasn't a big interest in learning about this for physicians. So you go where the love is, and that was where I turned my attention. Menopause is also another area of susceptibility for exposures in terms of hormone increases, hormone breakdown, and growth and development. I never thought about that until I am in now perimenopause, and boy, does it matter to me. So then I started really researching that as well. Now, as an immune system physician and trained in these areas, it was a really interesting correlation over the last 22 years of seeing more and more people, as I mentioned, coming in with, diseases that I would never expect, not textbook oriented in terms of their exposures, children with rheumatoid and younger people, elderly with rheumatoid and, lupus amongst people. And, just the list goes on about thyroid, Hashimoto's in young women. I mean, that was really epidemic and still is. So I started to pay attention to this in regards to not just the hormones and the endocrine system, but what about the immune system? And I talked about it with Fred von Saal after we had gotten done, a textbook in the book Non-Toxic, not Non-Toxic, which I loved writing with him. And I said to him, why is no one talking about immune effects? Even though we know it's in the literature, it's often tied to all the endocrine or EDC papers. And he said, well, I said, why don't we call them immune disrupting chemicals? And he goes, well, not only should you write it, or should it be written, you should write it because of your experience with immune disorders. So I tried to do that and really was pulling from the literature from these incredible scientists that showed that not only does BPA, for example, have hormone related changes, mimicking estrogens at low level, blocking testosterone low level, affecting adipocytes as obesogenic chemicals, affecting, growth and development, brain development, those kind of things, but had immune system effects. Could affect, whether or not we respond to vaccine exposure and whether we raise antibodies or not. Whether or not we set off a course of cytokines. These were being discovered about some of these chemicals, so I decided to put it into motion. Inflammation is a really catchy word. It's to me, chicken or the egg. Do we have diseases that create inflammation, or do we have inflammation and exposures to environmental chemicals, stress, and other things in our life that create inflammation? And I think the answer is really both ways. But I wanted to show that inflammation has now been identified, meaning, your immune system is reactive in all of these conditions. And I will say for my talk on osteoporosis and menopause that you could arguably say as well, through the gut microbiome, these chemicals can have effects on menopause and menopause related issues. Now, from an autoimmune perspective, we have 80 known, but again, there's always more to come, right? Because we didn't know long haul COVID, was identified until, we had COVID. So I keep the door open for new, autoimmune diseases being discovered, unfortunately. But they involve every human organ and cell type. It's an epidemic rise. We now know between 1%, almost 1 to 2% of the world's population of rheumatoid arthritis is increasing. And we know that a variety of other autoimmune diseases are increasing in epidemiology and in incidence, right? So new onset cases. We know more so that women are affected more than men. That's a whole nother discussion, but certainly estrogen is a component, but there's also a new gene called exist gene that I put in the new book, Detoxify, that was identified and has real interesting findings in regards to RNA balance and who's predisposed to autoimmune diseases, believe it or not. There's a lot of factors that we know are associated with autoimmune disease development. Now, in my book, I had to come up with a navigation tool in order to, decide how to teach, eighth graders all the way through physician training programs. And one of the ways I had to come up with is how do I make it simple that we can kind of wrap our head around this environmental health topic? Well, first of all, I believe everyone should assess. We don't want to move through a problem without really getting all the data and information. It doesn't mean testing up the yin yang. It doesn't mean blood test and urine. There's a whole, world of people taking advantage of fear of patients and doing 1,000 tests, which come back to the same punchline, which we'll get to a bunch of my punchlines. So I don't want people to spend their money in the wrong way, but you need to assess. You need a 50 question is what I came up with. Assessment of what do you eat, what do you drink, do you dry clean, do you drive through air quality issues going to work, do you have candles? Those are the kinds of things that, not for judgment. I color my hair, right? My kids play turf, on turf, and they're lacrosse players, right? It's not to judge, it's to assess. Then we can decide from there what to avoid if it's possible or reduce in terms of cleaning products and stuff like that, which is usually unnecessary. Too, what can we swap for products that we truly love, that we just want safer versions? Then what do we add? This is so critical as someone who studies integrative medicine. What do we add into the human existence Obviously, I love anthropology. What do we add that's been part of the human process for millions of years that has helped our body work best? Clean drinking water, certain nutrients, certainly the food quality, sweating, movement, stress reduction, sleep. What we know about sleep is remarkable. So, adding in is the second piece. You can take away all you want, but you have to add into the human body what it needs to help it help itself and to optimize, its ability to reduce cancers and other health issues. And then allow is my colored hair. It's my, occasional Skittles. It's my traveling. I just got back from vacation and drinking a million plastic water bottles. And, all of those things are the allows so that we can live well for where we can control, which is typically our home. And I would argue in schools where I lecture and try to get some of these administrators to pay attention. But that's the idea is let's figure out the allow and give ourselves a break for, a topic so we can do more where we can and control where we can. Diet is a really key area, right? I usually start with water or diet. Water is probably the most input into the human body, believe it or not, but diet is certainly up there. We know that the US diet is kind of a mess. It's filled with processed foods, chemicals. We know over 1,300, I believe, at least are allowable. It used to be just vinegar and salt. Now here we are. But look, this is the food industry. Crunch, preservatives, leaving, shelf life, flavoring, all of this is a big industry. And it's a hard battle, but we should, be thinking about the best we can do for ourselves and planning ahead for meals. Like I try to post on social media on the Smart Human. So the idea is that I want people to know it's not easy, but it's a great place to start making headway. When we think about food, it's not just the actual food, like macros, like protein and fats and carbohydrates. That's great. I mean, I think that's a really important conversation, right? You want to have more plant-based, in my opinion. Mediterranean diet is great because it's the most well studied in terms of inflammation reduction. But you have to take it, in my opinion, to a deeper level. You have to think about the quality of those fruits and vegetables and which ones have the most nutrition, actually, because then you get the twofold less chemicals plus bigger bang for your buck for your body. But thinking about how we clean our food is an issue. We want to start to think about how to clean that up, how we cook our food and what utensils and what pans, how we store our food. All of those are great areas to dive into once you're ready. And that's why I call it a journey for everybody. Of course, I walk people through that in my book, but you can get enough out of this conversation to really get started for sure. Organic matters, in my opinion, having done this for a very long time. Organic foods are incredibly accessible and incredibly low cost, especially when they're frozen. And when they're frozen produce, you can buy them off in every big box store across the country. ShopRite, Target, Stop and Shop, Wegmans, Kruger's, you name the big box stores that reach into Alabama and Kentucky and Appalachia. You can get to these stores, and these stores are now making their own lines of organic produce that are frozen. By the way, they have more nutritional value than most of the fresh supermarket organics because they travel long distances. They lose nutritional value since they were pulled out of the ground. So frozen or flash frozen, and they maintain all of the nutrient value. You want to just move them out of plastics and put them in glass and stainless steel to heat up. But organic took 20 years to develop. And I can tell you it's the only regulation, besides, say, the FDA with medications, it's the only regulation that has any teeth in our food and water systems. Okay, we'll get to water in a bit because you're going to be blown away by that, I hope. Um, Dirty Dozen Clean 15. Again, I've been working with EWG, Environmental Working Group, since 22 years ago. And we're big fans of each other, I think, because not many doctors at that time gave a damn about any of this stuff. And I was just really heartbroken. So I got into it. And then I thought that they were the few science, evidence-based consumer advocacy groups. And so I really do like their work. This is the list of produce they pull from the annual USDA data, by the way, that shows the pesticide levels on the most commonly used produce that's not organic. And the reason that's great to know is that if you don't have access to organic foods, you don't have a fresh farmers market here in Princeton. We have that, and we're blessed to have these organic farmers as well as conventional farmers that tell us what they, use, which you want to get to know all your farmers. This is a really great list. Is the Dirty Dozen. You might want to steer otherwise, or the Clean 15 if you can't find what you're looking for that are organic. I talked about nutrition in kids. So this is one of the talks I had to give for the Andrew Weil Center for Integrative Medicine in their nutrition conference, I think in 2018 or 19. And it turns out that the quality of our food and the chemicals in food can actually offset some of the genetic, and I say this, the epigenetic really effects from environmental exposures. Yes, we can have epigenetic, exposomic effects on our future risk of having health issues, but also our, generations to follow. It's a heavy pill to swallow. But when we talk about food as medicine, we now have science to back up which foods, which supplements, if you had to take them as supplements, really can offset some of the most critical exposures. Selenium, helpful with heavy metals and potentially reducing cognitive issues and dementia. We know omegas, iron, calcium, vitamin C, being nutritionally sufficient in those can actually offset lead exposure. We've seen these in kids' studies. So iodine, one of the big key issues with protecting the thyroid against very common everyday chemicals. Iodine is something no one takes in anymore. So iodine can be given in a multivitamin. So this is part of what I mention and talk about in the book, but what I teach with patients and any community that lets me into chat. Cruciferous vegetables are critical for their aggressiveness in upregulating liver function enzymes, cytochrome P450, in order to break down environmental chemicals that you may have no control over. Surprise, surprise, right? You can't control everything. But these vegetables are remarkably good at helping with liver function and detox. And there are many of them that I've never even considered cooking, nor have I heard of. And I think it's really important that when you start to think about veggies, maybe try one out a month that's new. So this has kind of been a challenge for myself and my own family. But really, there's so many of them that it's great to embrace those. Food storage, we want to kind of get away from plastics. I actually believe Tupperware was filed for Chapter 11 a few years back, and I found that interesting. But needless to say, this movement of getting away from plastics that could contribute microplastics into our food and water makes a lot of sense. What people don't know is that the food packaging industry, including canned foods, line cans with a plastic epoxy resin lining that is made up of BPA or BPA substitutions that have similar health effects. So when you think cans and you think of, say, cardboard containers that say, "Ooh, we're good for the environment," now we're in paper. Guess what? Paper soaks through, so there's clearly a plastic lining. Is there any way around this? Well, really carrying around your own bottles as best you can, and just really being conscious of when and how you drink your water and your food from the food packaging component and industry. And I do post a lot about that as well, because people don't realize that that's potentially an issue that they can control. Phthalates often are associated with things like vinyl flooring, vinyl shower curtains, but they also extend the life of perfumes and fragrances. That's part of why fragrances last so long and have a shelf life. And so thinking about even the most expensive perfumes, they're not is keeping you from having phthalates in your blood, in your system, right? We can test for these. They're tested by the CDC and NHANES data every 2 years. What we don't realize is that cost and money doesn't keep you from this. You have to be knowledgeable, choose your products wisely, and think about the fragrances that are part of products we bring into our home, including cleaning products as well. To avoid them, we want to think about the word fragrance or perfume and try to avoid that, because in that you can have up to 300 undisclosed proprietary chemicals. Okay. Old plastic toys, which makes plastics, are made with phthalates. Fortunately, there's a block on some of the newer toys that are made in this country from several years ago, but it doesn't mean that hand-me-down toys from other families, from any of the overseas plastics, they are not held to a standard of keeping those certain harmful phthalates out. And certainly heating food, storage bags, those kind of things, we want to avoid that if we can. And the triangle number 3 on the bottom of plastics is typically linked to vinyl. So that's something to avoid. Here's the plastics resins codes you can look up on the internet. 7 is typically BPA, 3 is typically vinyl. So I recommend people staying away from those two, as well as polystyrene, which is number 6. Sources of BPA. Well, again, there's people who say BPA free, and we know that we have regrettable substitutions now, like BPS, BPSIP. I can list hundreds of them. But the idea is that you want to try to avoid the plastics instead of taking the marketing from those who sell their products and say that. So I would recommend people avoiding receipts, which typically BPA seals, certainly heated, airline tickets and parking tickets and receipts. You can't always avoid it, but I always say, send it by email, print it out and fold it so you don't have to touch the ink, or have a special envelope that you put all these receipts in. People who occupationally, I ask this of all my patients, what do you do for work? Do you handle receipts? Can you wear nitrile, gloves if you're a checkout person? Can you put on Band-Aids on your fingertips to avoid some of that exposure if the Band-Aids are safer? The idea is that you want to be thoughtful, not crazy. Okay, that's the whole goal. I should name my book Thoughtful, Not Crazy. Maybe that would sell even more books. But anyway, the idea is that this is about having a reasonable conversation, trying to avoid where we can. As I mentioned, 7 is typically a BPA recycling code, meaning that there's BPA or bisphenol A in those plastics. But technically, the idea is to go upstream and avoid use of plastics wherever you can. Now, when it comes to personal care products, we all use them. We all love them. You should ask my teenagers. It's a nightmare. Anyway, adult women use on average about 12 products in a 24-hour period. Teen girls, this was a study by Environmental Working Group, use on average about 17 products. But I would argue with where we are now, this was an older study, that we now have boys like my boys using a zillion products. And I've asked them and I've worked with them, and you have to pick your battles when you're a parent. But now they use EWG's Healthy Living app. You can use Clearia, you can use Yucca, and you can really have these kids. And this is what I do with my teenage classes. I toss all these products and let them look them up with the app, with the website Skin Deep database, and they figure it out on their own. And now they have empowerment of their bodies. Men use as well about 6 products daily. And they too, if you're using the same products, why don't you just swap them out? You do it once and you're pretty much good. You might want to check in every couple of years on the owners of those products in terms of formulations. We know earlier puberty is a thing, right? We know teenagers are experiencing puberty at 8, girls 8, 9, 10 for their menarche and start of their periods, boys too. And a lot has been said about how these chemicals work on their hormones. Not just said, but researched internationally. This is a really important area, and really you just have to kind of go through and swap out products to safer versions. And entice kids to do this if they want. My kid wanted to go to summer camp and meet all the ladies. And I said, well, you have to go through the app and show me what you're buying. And then you can buy, 10 things, 5 things, whatever. And he learned, he did it, and he shared with his friends. We all can do it through ewg.org, Skin Deep, which is the website, and that's very easy to use. And also you can find, say, self tanner. I found one that was a 1, or conditioner. You'd be amazed what's being sussed out by these EWG folks. But they all use the same data bank pretty much. And Clearia, Yucca, and Healthy Living are the apps. Breast cancer, interesting. So we now have suspected risks, but we really have a lot of known risks. And a lot of them are solvents, benzene, polyaromatic hydrocarbons from aerosols, pesticides, certainly is big no-no. So I want people to understand that one of the reasons why we have such a high rate of breast cancer now is because of what we do in our lives and the choices we make. It's not to condemn, God knows. It's to really be thoughtful and empowered, and for our next generation, including, by the way, feminine care products, which we don't think about often as parents or even for ourselves, but that's a load of chemicals intravaginally, very absorbent. We know that. And we want to think about swapping that out because we have a lifetime of tampons and feminine care products to use. And why not intervene? I have a podcast called The Smart Human. I only interview the most incredible, if I can get them. Sometimes I woo them for a year. Um, so like Andrew Weil, I had a great conversation that took a while to get him on. But needless to say, this was one of the best conversations I've ever had. He's a breast surgeon, Dr. Goodson, and we talked about dense breast, we talked about breast cancer, and he even biopsied voluntarily about 20 volunteers that had no breast cancer history, but felt very compelled about his study. Gave breast biopsies. Then he helped them change their products, their personal care products for 28 days. And interestingly enough, all 28, same number, came back for rebiopsy, and he was able to prove, which made no news, of course, that that they had a change in their signal towards breast cancer development. This was huge because this was actual tissue based on actual behavioral change. And I encourage everyone to check out this podcast, my podcast, but also particularly this episode, and really check out the list of other topics that are interviewing some of the best researchers in these areas, like tattoos, uh, artificial turf. Again, very important to me. And so check out some of the topics if you get a chance. Air quality. Okay, so this is something we can very much participate in. Oop, am I running out of time? I just want to make sure I keep going faster. Air quality tips make a lot of sense. Don't bring in products if you don't need them. Pesticides, avoid if you can. That was the sign in front of my kids' daycare 20 years ago. I couldn't believe it. So lots of things we can do for pesticides, but keeping them out of your home, keep them out of your food is really key. Drinking water. We want to be thinking about all of the chemicals that get into our water system, our municipal and well water, and then going right after the Safe Drinking Water Act, which is kind of a joke. It's only 91 chemicals since 1976 that is still being managed in all of our 60,000 wastewater treatment plants. The punchline, again, just filter your water, your drinking water, tap or well water. And if you can do reverse osmosis, it's the most aggressive way to do that. And its price point is really reasonable now, which is why I have no shame in sharing amongst every socioeconomic community that I talk with. Tap Score is a great testing kit, but I don't want you to spend $300 when you can buy an RO filter for $300. So it makes no sense to test unless you have money to burn or you're very interested in knowing what's in your water system because it changes daily. How you transport water is important. Again, it's thinking about the whole system. Thinking about sleep, which is so critical to removing chemicals while we sleep. This is really interesting. So not just for refreshment, but we want to think about getting rid of chemicals in our cleaning system. Exercise and sweating, supplements that make sense to a lot of people, but I don't go near this many. I want people to think about food, prebiotic, probiotic foods that help support the gut microbiome. And so, we can get into talks about specific supplements. I actually talk about four that I talk about in the book that are the most critical. Not brain surgery here. It's just basically the best multi and how to find it, omegas, then how to find it because most of it's junk. Probiotics, how to find it, again, mostly junk, and then vitamin D3 and where that level should be. But these are the top 10, 12 changes. I covered most of them. Chemicals are not going away. We can't always change the laws as much as people try. And I support regulation on all of these things, right? Colors, preservatives, updated Safe Drinking Water Act. It ain't going to happen in our lifetime. So with all these chemicals, so I say we got to do it ourselves. I don't want people to be fearful. I want people to be empowered. This is my boys back then. Now this is my dog now, who's thankfully still thriving at age 11. If you feel like you want to share with your kids, your classrooms, your colleagues, this is a 13-minute talk on YouTube. You can just find it by typing my name and YouTube. These are the two books I was blessed to work with Frederick von Saal on, part of the Andrew Weil series, both academic and a guidebook. I'm very proud of those. And the first one has 26 of the world's leading specialists in environmental health for the textbook. This is my baby. This is the one I felt I could write from clinical experience and my practice over 23 years and kind of connecting it. If you feel that you want to follow, obviously the name is The Smart Human, in case you didn't figure that out. But I would love people to follow mostly on Instagram. My Facebook 52,000 was hacked and I lost the whole account. I wonder why. But it happened and I'm coming back out. And so anyone who wants to follow, certainly please feel free to check out any of these ways to do so and share with patients, share with colleagues and family and friends. Again, I don't sell anything, so I have no agenda other than to educate. Okay, that's it. I can stop sharing if people have questions.
Excellent. We do have about 5 minutes left for questions, so I encourage everybody to put your questions into the Q&A panel, and we will get through those. And I know you were working fast at the end there to get to time, so I did want to touch on an area that you went through a little bit quickly,
Yeah.
which is supplements, because we have a lot of brands and ingredient suppliers here, and I will say that the people who attend a call like this are the people who are putting in the science, looking at the regulations, and doing it right. So we don't have the junk on this call, I'm very proud to say. But on that note, I'm interested in when you're looking for a supplement, either personally or I know you're not selling anything, so I'm not asking specific brands, but what qualities are you looking for where you're like, that is a quality supplement that I know they've put in the work and I know they're communicating effectively, and I know that they're going to deliver? What are some of the parameters that you're looking at?
So, I'm looking at very basic things and I've stuck to very, very, very small handful of supplements. And really the decision to do that is a lot, right? In terms of what do my colleagues that I respect use? What are the bodies like, that are third party certified that are looking at these? Are there fillers? Are there preservatives? Are they disclosed? Is there transparency third party testing? Are these companies willing to show this data in full view? Are there 10 capsules per multivitamin? I think that's total BS. Is there, because that's just a volume problem, right? It may not be a quality problem, but it's a volume problem and it's a cost problem. And when I think about money, I think about what are people spending for and how can we make it the least costly to stay healthy or at least to try to prevent disease, right? So I think about how many pills it takes to get to what a clinical value would be, like EPA, DHA values, and how little they put into any products in general and sort of mainstream many of them brands. And I show my patients the different brands that show how little those effective doses are per serving per se. What else do I look for? I look for formulation changes. I think about, brands that are bought by one company and then sold to another, and does that change the formulations? So yeah, there's a lot that goes in, but the idea is it's a gathering of information over time. It's also an effectiveness. One of the unique things I have to be blessed with is the ability to see cause and effect, not really cause and effect, but association and effect with the regimen and the process I do with patients. And I keep it incredibly simple. Patients aren't on, if I can help it, 20 different supplements. They're going to get a lot from food, but then there's some things you can't get enough of from diet. And so I can see if a certain probiotic has an effect on so many patients, or I can see if omegas seem to be helping, and again, life, we're not mice in a cage that can be controlled for so many confounders, but it certainly has given me a level of insight that I don't think just a bottle can do.
Excellent. All right. So, again, with the people that we have on this call, we're all looking for ways to improve and to best serve people and the planet. So the natural products industry certainly wants to be part of the solution. Where do you see the greatest opportunities for brands and the ingredient suppliers on this call to help their consumers or the end consumer reduce exposures? Where do you see that we can kind of step in and do the best that we can do?
Well, first of all, I applaud people doing the right way, right? The good guys. It's hard to suss out the good guys in a field where everything is based on money, right? In the whole world. But I really do applaud companies and groups that are transparent, that are vocal, that go the hard route to not go after the money, but go after the passion and the mission. So listen, I think that every human being is a touch point. I think the barber who talks about prostate cancer with those in their chair, I think that's a touch point. I think there's a lot of ways that we can reach people that you would never expect to. And so I encourage everyone individually within these companies to really, embrace this kind of movement. But I also think that, when it comes to companies, and I've consulted with a lot of companies, I don't have to sell products to consult and help them be better. But the idea is that you want to give them the best way to educate, because that's my mission, is to educate. So having the right materials, also supporting those who don't get it right and who don't have a perfect lifestyle. I think that was the allow that really helped me reach more people because, and I talked to pharmaceutical companies and said, why don't you have someone running your integrated, a rheumatology, but an integrative component where you're talking about food and diet? It's not going to work against your bottom line. You're going to support them for what they're doing anyway in a safe and reasonable way by taking appropriate supplements, So I think it's just a matter of really being human and understanding that humans are not perfect and they're not dumb. And that's why you have to gear up marketing in the right way that doesn't put one over on them.
I think I really love that about your whole message, and of course encourage people to pick up the book. But it's that this can be a topic that is just so overwhelming, to the point of being just completely alarming, and you don't want people to shut down. And you do such a great job of balancing that. Here's what you can do. If you can't do everything, do what you
So
can.
what? Keep moving, like never give up. But just, mostly what I've seen, and again, like I said, I think when it matters is when it hits your heart, when it's something that actually affects your heart and it matters to you. Like I didn't care about menopause and environmental health. Really, I was too busy until, hey, one morning I woke up, I'm like, I'm in perimenopause. I better pay attention to this. And sure enough, it created a talk about it because, I realized there's so much science that's not really out there in a way that I thought, none of it was out there in terms of environmental chemicals, but really the idea that we have an intervention period sort of throughout our lives. And when it matters to you, is your dog getting sick? Is your child ill? Are you having breast cancer? It's about how to do better. It's not always to prevent, it's how to manage these diseases. Inflammation, I talk about in the book. We can intervene with people who already have chronic illnesses and we can make them maybe better. So, it's for really everybody to think about, not just those trying to, the walking well.
Absolutely. All right. Well, on that note, thank you so much for joining us. It has been our pleasure to have you here today. And we're all going to head over to the Smart Human and follow along and stay up to date on all the latest. Before I turn it over to you, Len, I just want to say we got a comment with somebody who was just loving the presentation, loving the slides, and wants to know if they'll be able to catch on demand. Yes, this will be available on demand, so you'll be able to access all of that content again. So thank you, Dr. Cohen. Wonderful to have you with us.
You're welcome. Thanks for listening, everybody, and be well, please. Take care.